First of all, thank you so very much for finding the time for us, and we really appreciate it and
Oh,
what a privilege it is.
oh, well, you're welcome. I'm happy to be with you, and hopefully it can be it'll be an interesting discussion. So I know you've done quite a few of these.
Yeah, I think
And
it's like, almost almost 20 of them, I guess, altogether. I
really,
yeah, with the foreign interviewees. Um,
right.
all right, so let's just jump into it then, perhaps. I'll write the introduction for you afterwards to the newspaper and
Okay.
um, as I wrote in the email, perhaps I mean if we look at your biographies that you've written, JFK. Well, JFK is not strictly speaking a biography. I understand, right? That's more, but RFK, Jesse Ventura, James Hillman. Is there a common theme there?
Yeah, it's I only thought about this recently in terms of my writing life. That it all seems to be about exposing or bringing to light what is hidden or not known. That started, when I investigated the assassination of President Kennedy in the 1970s, and for a couple of years I was the first journalist on the road doing that in America. And then that was my first book, which I published in 1992. That was, exposing the fact that there was a conspiracy. I mean, other people have posited that as well, but I really probably knew more about it than any journalist in America. And then my next book, Black Genius and the American Experience, was really about, bringing to light how ancestors influenced future great African Americans. Like I did a comparative chapter on Frederick Douglass and James Baldwin, for example. And again, it was kind of bringing to the surface things that weren't widely known. And then my next book was called Eye of the Whale, which was following the gray whale migration, but it was inspired by the mystery of the fact that all of a sudden in the 1970s, these amazing animals started coming up to people out of the blue in Mexico at their lagoon, and the mothers would introduce their babies, and you could be rubbing the baleen in their mouths. I mean, it was truly an incredible experience. Um, so all of that kind of fits this pattern, I guess, or my soul's code of that eventually leads me to James Hillman, whom I met in 1998. And we can talk about that too a little bit, my how the biography came to be, because and it's continued up to this day. My most recent books, I did a biography of Robert Kennedy Jr., who was a longtime friend of mine, and we worked together on environmental issues for years. And again, he's been very maligned in the American media, especially lately. It went over his public health stances, and now his joining President-elect Trump, which was a surprise to me as well. But at any rate, again, it's trying to give an accurate picture of somebody that's not as well known in terms of what their character really represents in the country. And then I did one other book called My Mysterious Son. I've
Mm.
done 16 books altogether, but My Mysterious Son was rather really inspired by the fact that, well, we can talk about that because there's a connection to James Hillman as well, but it's about giving a different slant on what schizophrenia is, if indeed it's schizophrenia. I mean, because my son was afflicted with that since he was 17 years old, and eventually it was alternatives such as finding an amazing West African shaman that led to really helping him through his ordeal. So that's a sort of a quick answer to your question.
Right. So the other I I listened to your podcast with the Jung and the World podcast just today, and you said that you had no prior exposure to the depth psychology before the Hillman biography. So I would assume that this is somehow related to the sun, to the problems with the sun that you just alluded to, that took you to depth psychology, or
Well, that was certainly part of it. I mean, originally, back in the early 1970s, I had uh, left America, traveled for a year and a half as a young adult, and it was in Liverpool actually that I discovered Jung and
Mm.
read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, read, a lot of his work at that time, and I was just really taken by Jung. Not anticipating that someday I would meet James Hillman and become his biographer. So that was really the beginning. I was always interested in depth psychology in that sense, but I wasn't a student of it. I
Yeah.
didn't major in psychology in school. Um, I became a journalist very young and an investigative journalist. So, but it was certainly once my son had was diagnosed with a mental illness that led me, deeper into the field of psychology and having to figure out what was the best way to help him.
Right. This is not the main theme of this interview, but just since you mentioned that was that your first book was on JFK's conspiracy, right?
Yes.
How did you? Just I mean, as I said, this is not the main topic of this today's, but just out of curiosity, how did this book came to be? How
Well,
did?
it's kind of a mysterious story, actually. I was in high school, a junior in high school, when President Kennedy was assassinated, and I was not particularly political. I mean, it of course affected me, and I remember exactly where I was and who told me what had happened, and somebody I barely knew, but I still can remember his name from that moment in time in '63. Um, but I wasn't very political. I was a sports writer, and my whole life was devoted to that, really. Um, until I'd left, I was very successful very young, and I went to work for Sports Illustrated magazine when I was 20. And then it was the '60s, and a lot was changing in the world, and I was waking up to there was something else going on besides sports, and so I quit my dream job and took off with a backpack and a portable typewriter and traveled the world for a year and a half. And
That was in Liverpool then when
exactly. That was toward the beginning. And
Mhm.
then toward the end of the trip, I was in Egypt and then in the Middle East, in Jordan and the Sinai Peninsula. And I had this series of strange experiences after I was at the Sphinx and the pyramids. I, I, uh, I snuck past the guards and I slept in my sleeping bag at the feet of the Sphinx. And I got up at dawn and climbed the Great Pyramid before anybody saw me. You can't do that anymore. And they would have stopped me then if they saw me. But I felt this strange energy as if there was something directing my soul. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. Um, and after that, at first I met this old man on a boat going to Jordan, and he ended up telling me that he had been part of the CIA and that he thought he knew who killed President Kennedy. And he wasn't right about that, but it was sort of well, that's interesting, and I'd never thought about it. And then at the very end of that trip, a guy took me on his motorcycle to the base of the Sinai Peninsula, and this fellow came up to me out of nowhere and said, "Would you follow me? I want to show you something." And he took me to the edge of the Sinai where Moses crossed the Red Sea, and he pointed to this rock, big rock. And I said, "Wow, well, who carved that? That's President Kennedy in profile. Who carved it?" He said, "No one carved it. It's always been there," and walked away.
Oh.
And if you look online and you Google Kennedy Rock Sinai, you will see that rock. But
Oh.
at the time, I didn't take a picture. I thought, did that really happen? And but it did. And then a few years later, I began to look into the Kennedy assassination. So I don't know. How do you explain these things?
Oh. Uh, well, then perhaps let's move to the Hillman biography then. I've listened to so many of your podcasts. I know the story, but our listeners won't. So please just go. Could you just talk about your first? I mean, how this biography came to be?
Yeah, well, in the 1990s, my wife and I were and our group of friends that we lived with got into studying Hillman and were fascinated by his book, The Soul's Code, and by A Blue Fire. It was an anthology of his writings, and it kind of took me back to when I first discovered Jung. And so it turned out then one day we were in the kitchen and the young man was there whose father was an organic farmer who lived in Connecticut, and we were talking about Hillman. He says, "Oh, my dad knows James Hillman. He sells him his organic vegetables in the market." I said, "Oh my God, well, that's really interesting. I would love to meet him sometime. Do you think that might be possible?" And he said, so I called my that's what my friend said when I called him up. He said, "Well, I don't know. He's a very private person, but he finally, I think I sent him a copy of Black Genius, my book, and he was willing to have lunch. So my wife and I went and had lunch with him and my farmer friend, and we found we had, a lot in common. We didn't even talk much about psychology. We talked about common interests in, we both liked boxing, and I had known Muhammad Ali, and we both traveled in Africa, and so we had common interests in those things. And then it was a friendship that grew over time. I mean, James Hillman was 21 years older than I, and he'd never wanted anybody to do a biography of him. He eschewed biography. He thought it was, just didn't think it was important. Um, anyway, he became interested. He would visit us at our home, my extended family, and in 2000, at the end of 2004, I guess, um, his older sister came to Connecticut, where James Hillman lived with his wife Margot, and she was telling stories about their past and growing up in Atlantic City. And I said to James afterwards, "Wow, you should get some of her stories on tape while she's around." She was getting up there in years, and gave him the idea to bring together his siblings. His four siblings, three siblings were still alive, and as many of his kids as could come to their home in Connecticut that summer and film it and talk about growing up and what it was like. And so I was there for that. A young woman that grew up in my family came and was the filmmaker, and I was the investigative reporter, right? So I was asking all these questions, and at the end of that, Margot and my wife Alice were talking and wondering, was he ever going to write a biography? And they kind of concluded, if he was, then maybe I'm the one who should do it. So that's how it happened. Totally, I don't know, synchronistic, or I honestly do think it was meant to happen somehow. I mean, written in my soul's code and his. I mean, um, it turned out I was born, my birthday was the same as his mother's, which
Mm.
is always interesting, August 19th. And we had shared interest in astrology, which we can talk about in a minute. And uh, so, when I was young, I had a similar problem with my penmanship. He wrote about this in the Soul's Code, that he he felt like, well, he was giving examples. One of them was the bullfighter Manolete in the Soul's Code, who used to hide behind his mother's skirts when he was 9 years old because his soul sensed or knew that someday he was going to be facing these huge bulls in the ring. And for both James Hillman and myself, I mean, our penmanship was terrible. I had to, use what do you call it, a protractor or something they tried to make me a lefty into a righty. And he had some of the same issues, as if, in our, I mean, he was going to write all these books, 20, he's wrote 20 some very heavy duty books, as we know. And I ended up writing books on all these different subjects, and instead of just being a sports writer. And so there's these kind of curious parallels that we had.
Uh, Well, as we agreed in our previous email exchange, that the Soul's Code just came out in Estonian
Ah,
a couple of months ago, actually.
ah, great to
Weeks,
see.
Couple of weeks.
couple of weeks.
Oh yes, couple of weeks. Yeah, that's true.
It's brand new.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
What I am, and I also wrote that I read over the summer the first two volumes of your biography, and now I ordered the third on hard copy as well. So I just read today your chapter on the soul's code. Just mm, uh, what would how did you find this book? I mean, I understand that your first encounter with Hillman was through Soul's Code, right?
Yeah, well, I thought it was an amazing idea. I mean, and something in me intrinsically believed it.
Mm.
Um, I guess it goes all the way back to Plato and Plotinus that James Hillman was very interested in. There's this great quote. I'll read it to you from. I was looking at the chapter again today too, and this is
Mhm.
how the chapter starts with Plato's Republic,
Yeah.
saying, "When all the souls had chosen their lives, they went before Lachesis, and she sent with each as the guardian of his life and the fulfiller of his choice, the daimon that he had chosen." And
Hmm.
that's the basic idea, And Jung had it too. And Hillman called it. His theory was it was the acorn and the oak that we grow down into like the roots of a tree into our lives. And if you look at life lived backwards, you often see the seeds of who you're to become in the fact that what happened to you when you were young. I mean, he does this in a way that indicates the soul chooses the parents.
Hmm. Yeah.
Now that's a pretty radical idea. It's also very much against the psychology grain in the sense of the typical, the psychology often emphasizes our parents and what we didn't get when we were children and how we were victimized, and he takes it beyond that, to an idea that a lot of what happens to us in life is not written per se. I mean, it's not like we don't have free will to make choices in life. We do, but there is this guiding ghost in a sense that's our higher self, the daimon. The Germans called it a doppelganger.
Hmm.
Um, in the Kabbalah, I guess that's the idea of growing down into the world from your roots. So it as Hillman said once, it's independent of circumstances
Hmm.
and not traceable to external causes. Many of the things that we experience in life or the destiny that we have written for us. So that's the kind of the basic idea, and it goes all the way back, as of course, to Plato and to Socrates, used the word daimon, um, and then, as I say, Jung picked up on it and spoke of it himself in a similar kind of vein. It was also the fact that Hillman noted that pathologies and peculiarities of childhood are as important as passions and fixations. So that was very much in line with the psychology that he was developing.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds so strange and so foreign when set against our presuppositions. Um,
Yeah,
I
it
mean,
doesn't. Go
yeah,
ahead.
please go
Well,
ahead.
it's not, this does not mean he didn't include reincarnation in this. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah,
this is,
that I also read. Yeah.
yeah, it's not a spiritual idea. It's not metaphysical even per se, because his emphasis was always on the soul and what the soul needs in order for us each individually and collectively to develop more fully as individuals. And um, so I mean, right from the very beginning, his second book was called Suicide in the Soul, where he was giving a very different perspective on suicide and death and dying than existed at the time. Um, so and all of his work really follows this. He always emphasized the importance of things like depression and that we had to come to grips with these things and pathologizing. It was a very big part of his psychology.
Yeah, this sentence that really struck me when you I mean you quote when his first book Emotion came out and he sent it to the American publishers and they rejected it by saying that if this book is published, this would set psychology back to 300 years. That really wow. That
And he was happy. Hellman was happy about
oh yeah,
that.
I would
That's what he
imagine.
wanted to do, to revive these traditions that went all the way back to the Greeks and to the Renaissance.
Mhm.
Um, he considered Ficino, who was a Renaissance figure, I think in the late 1400s, and also an astrologer, um, as one of his as a precursor for him. And back when he was first after he we won't get into his whole biography here, but he became the first director of studies at the Jung Institute in 1961 after getting to know Jung. We can talk about his relationship with him a little bit too, but um, uh, in the last years of Jung's life, um, and he started this thing called Spring House, which it was a place, it was a building in Zurich where he brought together there were all these young people coming to Zurich at that time looking for something, and they were discovering Jung and wanting to go to the Jung Institute, and so so they had these weekly gatherings at the Spring House where James Hillman and Pat Barry, his second wife, and who became his second wife, and it started off as a student of his, and Rafael Lopez Pedraza, who was this wild, Cuban, uh, fantastic, ideas and all these young people, and they would gather and they would talk about ancient things, like stuff that nobody really knew about, like the Memory Theater of Don Camillo in the Renaissance period, and the Picatrix, which was this obscure medieval text, and so they were working on these Renaissance ideas and trying to bring them back into the consciousness. And um, yeah, one time there's a story of Lopez Pedraza where he was, extrapolating on one of these subjects, and all of a sudden this drunken bum came walking down the street and fell through the window. And Lopez Pedraza was so excited. He says, "You see, we constellated."
Yeah, yeah. From what I inferred from your book, he was quite a character, wasn't he, the Pedraza?
Quite a character. Yeah, there's a lot of stories about him.
I mean, I vividly remember this place when one of these customers or clients or patients said that he or she, I can't remember, is going to commit a suicide, and Petraza answered that, send me a postcard.
Yeah, that's right. It's another story. Yeah. But
I, yeah, please go ahead.
oh, I was just thinking about Jung and Hillman's relationship with Jung because it was so interesting. I remember one of the first things that before I was ever doing the biography or anything, I was very curious about his relationship with Jung. He was over one night and I said, "What was it like, being around?" He said, "It was like getting too close to the
Mhm.
sun.
Yeah.
You felt like you were going to be burned." He was just this
Mhm.
magnetic force, and so many of the young people around him, felt that they were afraid, because that they would lose themselves in this tremendous personality of Jung's. And but Hillman spent a lot of time, well, not a lot of time, but enough time with him, and he dreamt about him. And one of his early dreams was images of Jung was as an old alchemist in a tower covered with salt, which Hillman thought that salt, of course, is like the image of it keeps one fixed in a particular
Mm.
place, and he felt like he needed that in Zurich. He'd gone through. He started off wanting to be a writer. I mean,
Yeah.
do you want to talk a little bit about his early years? I can if you want.
Yeah, why not? Yeah, please, 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 please.
Well, it's kind of significant because he grew up in Atlantic City, New Jersey, and in the heyday when Atlantic City was like Las Vegas today. It was just this wildly extroverted place.
Yeah, this jumping with the horse lady, that was just amazing when I just couldn't believe my eyes when I read that.
Yeah, I mean, it was just so he grew up in this very extroverted world on the one hand, but in the winter everybody would go away, and it was very
Mhm. Yeah.
introverted, and he was walk the beaches by himself, and but his father was a famous, well, I don't know if famous, but he was a hotelier. He had these two hotels in Atlantic City, so James grew up knowing all these fascinating people that his parents would have over for dinner, as he later said, exposed to all these different kinds of psyches, including like the fellows who worked in the down below in the underground of the hotel, and he used to go down and just hang out with them and get their stories, and the guys who ran the I don't know, kept the hotel going, right? So he had all of this in his youth, and then um, he wanted to be a writer, and so he met this. He was studying actually, I guess we'll talk about astrology in a minute, but in his sort of his Saturnian period, um, he went into the Navy in World War II. But what his it was toward the end of the war, and his eyesight was so bad, so he wouldn't couldn't be in combat. Um, so he took care of blinded soldiers. So it was his first exposure to the therapeutic world. And then after that, he got TB, tuberculosis, in the late 1940s, and barely made it through. So um, he was going through a lot of uh, formative experiences in that period. And then he met this beautiful Swedish woman, Kate Kempe, and they ended up traveling in Africa together and then living in Kashmir for about I guess a couple of years. And he was going to write the great American novel, and and then um, but at the end of that trip, he met a guru named Gopi Krishna who said, you have to go to the mountains. You must go to the mountains because that's where you'll get the great dream, the big vision of what your future will be.
Mhm.
So Hillman and Kate went to the mountains of outside Kashmir, and his dream was of his mother and his grandmother in bunk beds, and it's freaked him out. I mean, it was like this was the big dream. So he went basically running down the mountain and into. They went to. He decided he needed an analysis, and they were going to go to Zurich, and he even had a Kundalini experience that on the way to that right before he got married. So he was really going through it, and when he got to Zurich, then that's when he became part of the Jung Institute and also the university, and got to know Jung.
Anything you would like to ask?
Yeah, you touched already very briefly that Ilman speaks about soul and what soul does want. And I remember one quote uh, when Hillman says that um, soul wants to be touched, but nothing moves or touches souls better than beauty.
Yes, that was hugely important to him. The aesthetic and the imagination, the
Mhm.
power of the imagination and the imaginal, which is these are obviously soul qualities and there's a quote that he loved from the poet W.H. Auden, which was, "We are lived by powers we pretend to understand."
Yeah.
Mm.
I love that quote too.
Yeah, I
Mm.
love it too. Yeah, that's
And
hey, yeah, please
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so the other thing that he emphasized in terms of this of the soul's code was ancestry. And he felt like your grandparents and the great grandparents were just as important, if not more important, than your parents. And he would raise these questions. Think of what imagine in therapy sessions. He was also a therapist, and he said, imagine what would it be like? Could you with all your great grandparents in the same room? Could you
Yeah.
sit around the same table and what would you have in common? What would you be able to talk about? So he was one of them was a famous rabbi named Joseph Krauskopf on his mother's side, and then on his father's side there were military people. And that was a very big aspect of James Hillman's nature. Also, the sort of the martial. His final book was called A Terrible Love of War,
Mhm.
um, and so that again, you want to talk soul's code ideas. Those are part of it as well.
Richard Tarnas has emphasized on several places that there were like two major things in depth psychology that grew out of Jung, Hillman and Groff. But I don't think I checked the index now. The name of Stanislav Grof does not come up. What were there? How did they relate to each other? Or
No, I don't. They never had a relationship. So, I mean, Stanislav Grof was very into things like the importance of psychedelics, and
yeah.
and James Hillman never was interested in that.
Mhm.
Um, a little bit afraid of it, I think. Just didn't seem to fit into his world. No, I think but they both Groff and Hillman had very strong relationships with Rick Tarnas,
Mhm.
and who's an amazing astrologer, and I know you've had him on your show. And so, and Rick did an amazing analysis of Hillman's chart, which we can talk about for a minute if you'd
Yeah,
like. I mean,
Yeah.
please, yeah, that would be nice nice way to segue into the astrology bit about.
yeah, I mean, he this was 1992. There was this big festival at Notre Dame, and Tarnas gave a whole talk about Hillman's chart, which is quite an extraordinary chart. I mean, I'm not an astrologer, but I'm very interested in astrology, and neither Hillman nor I have any Earth in our charts, by the way, which is kind of another interesting thing we have in common. Um, so I remember very first time I met him, he said we were exchanging what our signs were, and he said, "What are you?" And I said, "No, I'm a Leo. I'm a Libra." He said, "Oh, that's just as bad as his double Aries." He had both his sun and his moon were just conjunct, and aspects in an astrological chart for people who don't know is like the geometrical relationship between two planets when you're born, and it brings these archetypes into play. And excuse me, in Hillman's case, yeah, he had the sun and the moon right there in Aries, and both of them uh, uh, trine to the planet Neptune, which a trine is a very favorable astrological aspect. And he was born on a new moon also, which is, he says he was always, the beginnings were very, very important to him. But Neptune is the planet of imagination and spirituality and transcendence, and also of illusions and delusions and confusion. So it has that, rules kind of dreams and sleep, and people often talk about madness and drugs being related to Neptune as well. Jung had Neptune square his sun, so that's a very difficult aspect. That sometimes in Jung's life, it called his very identity into question. He had all these not necessarily wanted visitations from spirits when he was setting down the Red Book,
Mm.
um, which he kept secret. I mean, he did not share this with the public or beyond his family, and so it's just a difference between a square and a trine in the two charts. But in Hillman's chart, he also had Jupiter and Mars opposite Neptune, and Saturn square Neptune. Now that I don't want to get too technical here for people who don't know much about astrology, but Jupiter is the planet of expansion, and sometimes too much of a good thing with an opposition. So, people have said, I mean, Hillman's kind of the philosopher of imagination in a lot of ways as a psychologist. But some people felt he put too much emphasis on the imaginal or the imagination uh, and left out more important things. So, um, anyway, that's he also has the planet Mercury, which is the messenger planet of ideas, and conjunct right next to Uranus, which Tarnas pointed out too. That's the planet of revolution
Mhm.
and um, awakening, and um, the trickster. Now
Mm.
Hillman in his writing often is kind of a trickster, and he
Mhm.
commented on this once. That his editors um, would sometimes try to change his paragraphs because the way he would write something, he would put the main idea at the end instead of at the beginning, and the editors thought that was too confusing, but that was by design, and often in his writing he said what did he say once about Hermes? I forget the exact line, but anyway, Hermes was the trickster in Greek mythology, and he identified with Hermes in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
But how did your personal interest in psychology in astrology start?
I guess it was, I knew two astrologers when I became part of a large extended family or community back in the early 70s. There were two astrologers there that had my chart read, and it just made a lot of sense to me. I was born in 1947 with 5 planets in Leo, and 3 of them conjunct Saturn, Pluto, and Mercury. And I could kind of it was explained to me how that would pretty make a writer, and a very purposeful writer, because of those particular aspects. So that was that was one thing. And then so I would just have my chart done through the years, periodically, to find out what was going on, and it was a big help in getting through different difficult parts of my life, and kind of getting a glimpse at what was going on in a cosmic sense that was beyond what otherwise I might just be drowning in.
Mm.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know what's your family background, but when did you kind of I mean, if I look at my kind of trajectory, I started watching TV, and there was not much astrology, no depth psychology, no Jung, no no nothing.
Right.
But and suddenly it started to come, and I've had my fair share of personal problems to deal with. But how did you kind of gradually? I mean, we touched upon it a little bit earlier already, but would like to um, come back to that. How did you drop off from from the TV?
Um, yeah, I grew up with TV too, of course,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
and I watched all kinds of shows, and I was writing from a very young age. I mean, from the time I was 7, I was writing short stories, and I was spending most of my time in school writing little stories.
Mm.
And
Oh.
then most of my teachers, until 4th grade anyway, they would let me read them to the class. And so I was kind of a prodigy in that sense, until I had a teacher who decided I should be actually studying and doing something besides learning some math. And I got a bad report card. I came running home in tears, and she didn't recognize me. So
Which part of the States are you from, by the way?
I'm a Midwesterner.
I mean,
Born in Minneapolis and raised in suburbs of there, until I was 5, and then Chicago and Kansas City. And so I was a Midwestern kid. I went to the University of Kansas, and as I said earlier, I loved sports. I was not a good athlete, so I just became this fanatic collector of everything, cards and books, and began writing about the teams in my local area when I was 15. Um, so, I was just sort of a typical Kansas kid until the late 60s. And that's when I woke up. There was a civil rights movement. There was a Vietnam War. There were hippies. My friends were becoming hippies, some of them. And so I changed. Um, and then as I began to travel and be exposed to the world and do crazy things like hitchhike across the Sahara Desert, and I wrote, and it's amazing. Back in those days, in 1970, 71, I'd saved a couple $1,000s from the magazine when I quit Sports Illustrated. But in a year and a half, I spent $4,000. I mean, it's amazing to think about. You could do that now in a week traveling. So, um, anyway, it was a great time. I mean, you could hitchhike everywhere. I
Mhm.
slept wherever, and learned so much as I went, because I met so many different kinds of people, and traveled with a photographer friend for a while, and it opened me up in ways that I've I think forged a path for the
So
rest
this
of my life.
traveling experience was the formative kind of influence which opened.
Absolutely, and that was true for Hillman too. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm not to draw too many comparisons, but he was always he spent a lot of time in Africa when he was younger, and then lived abroad in Kashmir, and as I said, and so he had that wanderlust as well that was very formative for him.
Yeah. You mentioned well, I've read the book, but our readers have most of them, or absolute majority of them haven't. You mentioned the Kundalini awake. Did you say awakening, or Kundalini episode right after? Well, that was around his wedding party, right?
Yes,
Did you mean that?
yeah.
Yeah. Could you just put more color on that one?
Yeah, well, as I recall, I mean, he'd met this Indian mystic, Gopi Krishna,
Mhm.
who talked to him about the Kundalini and the big dream, and then right when he was about to get married, I mean, he had this experience with, it's like this, I don't know, this tremendous energy, like arrows, or just shooting through his up his back, through his spine, and he was scared. I mean, he didn't know what was going on. He didn't know what was happening to him. Um, so it was, and then he ended up writing a book actually. In 1967, he was back in touch with Gopi Krishna, and wrote a book with him, kind of as the commentary to a book on Kundalini. So he was not Hillman was not someone who uh, was that drawn to the East after he lived there. He differentiated a lot between the more spiritual path of, Eastern thought and Hinduism and Buddhism. He wanted to stick with the Western idea of soul, and I think he had a debate once with I forget the guy's name now, but anyway, he was very um, he was uh, he was angered at the direction of therapy, and he spoke often of the importance of of realizing we have all these gods within us, these various gods that go back centuries. I mean, the images of these gods, and polytheism, the importance of that, and um, versus monotheism, which he felt that the Christian idea of monotheism kept things very rigid um, and did not enable us to go into areas of our psyche that it was really important to explore, which he talked about at the Terry Lectures at Yale in 1974, and really devoted his whole life to writing about. Um, in a He formed what's called archetypal psychology. The archetypes that live within us and around us and are bigger than us. Um, we really need to think about, talk about, learn about. So, yeah, I guess that's what I would say.
Yeah, it takes us back again to this. I also I very much agree with you that the W.H. Auden's quote that you just mentioned a few minutes ago, that we live by powers we pretend to understand. And I was listening to one of his speeches that he gave. I guess it was on the Jung's Red Book in the Library of Congress, when he mentioned that. Or he said this quote again right at the outset of his speech. Could you just how do you take that Auden's quote? "We live by powers we pretend to understand." Would be interesting to hear your take on that.
Well, I think it's sort of kind of self-explanatory in the sense of um, Hillman's whole idea of the daimon and the
Mhm.
soul's code that is part of us when we come here to this planet, um, and that there are these greater forces, and that we embody them, and they live through us, and it's partly ancestral and partly karmic and all these kinds of things. But in other words, he doesn't deny the importance of the metaphysical, but and maybe even he might have even said he does, but and yet his psychology really goes in that direction towards these invisible entities, that inhabit our world and ourselves. And I believe in that. I've always felt it, actually, I guess, since I was a kid. I felt when I was in my, not to be too whatever about it, but I felt I had some kind of destiny, that I had to follow. I didn't know what it was, and it's continued to unfold as I've gone through my life, and including a lot of unexpected things. Um, but James Hillman was a very important figure in my life. I mean, not a father figure really, but someone, and certainly not a therapist. I mean, we didn't do therapy together. Um, but he was very helpful with my son, which I could talk about a little bit. He,
Yeah,
he
please do that. That's again, I know the story in broad outlines, but it would be interesting for our readers and listeners.
Yeah, well, eventually I wrote a book called My Mysterious Son, A Life-Changing Passage Between Schizophrenia and Shamanism. Um, so the short stories, I mean, my son was 17 when he had the classic kind of breakdown, and out of nowhere, it happens to thousands of parents. Um, Diagnosed schizoaffective or schizophrenic, was hospitalized off and on for some time. And one time I was up visiting James Hillman, and he could sense something. He was very intuitive, and he said, "Something bothering you?" And I said, He says, "And is it your son?" So I said, "Yes, it was." And he gave me some incredible, unsolicited, really, advice, which was to just, he said, everybody wants to categorize him, change him. Just treat him like a normal person. See what happens. Just um, get into ask him how his day was. Tell him what your day has been like. If he goes into delusions, just go there with him. Sort of ride that wave and see what happens. And it was really amazing because as soon as I started doing that, because with schizophrenia, you often do have, the person who's affected makes up stuff, and just creates out of whole cloth. Oh, I built that building over there. I did this, I did that. And my son would do that, and I would often cringe kind of, as like especially if we were in a public setting. And once I started to just hang out with him, um, he really appreciated that. And then we could have some fun with it too. I mean, one time we were in a Chinese restaurant in Boston, and he started talking in a made-up Chinese language, and to the waiter, and the waiter didn't know quite what to make of it, and so he came by again, and Franklin looks at him and says, "Oh, don't worry." He says, "I'm talking to you in Mandarin, but he only understands Cantonese, meaning me." So that was and we laughed, and we started just having fun, and then eventually I through James Hillman again, um, came to a man named Melodoma Somé, who was a shaman from West Africa, who had come to America, and become part of the men's movement that James Hillman was also part of in the early 1980s and into the 90s, with the poet Robert Bly and Michael Meade, storyteller, and that's an incredible. I write about that quite a bit in volume 2 of the biography. How important that men's movement was in his life, James Hillman's life. And there was a man that he met there at a remarkable gathering of 50 black men and 50 white men in the woods of West Virginia, named Malidoma Somé. And James always said, you've really got to talk to Melodoma. You should interview him about me. And so I did over the phone. And then just kind of years went by. And when I'd been at a conference, and I was really desperately looking for some kind of, not, complete alternative to medication, but something that would help change this situation where, that medications just put so much weight on you, and didn't really help that much in a lot of ways. So I went back and found Malidoma, and I did a divination with him. We developed an amazing relationship that I chronicle in My Mysterious Son, which was again attributable to my relationship with James. I never would have met him, and was hugely important in not curing the so-called disease, but you know, uh, schizophrenia is a they're very connected to other worlds, and in other cultures, like in Africa, shamans are they have this kind of what we would call schizophrenia,
Mhm.
but actually because so I and what was amazing with Franklin too, when Hillman was still alive, he would tune into things about James. And Franklin was very interested in astrology. And one time he said, "My birthday is April 12th, which is James Hillman's birthday." Um, he would, uh, he would, one time he said, "Oh, yeah, I know, you're going to see him again. Yeah, he wrote the human genome." I said, "Well, no, it was the soul's code." Franklin says, "Well, that's what I mean." So, um, he had this, and then when James Hillman uh, died, um, Franklin was seeing, dead, bodies in the room where he was living, and was very in tune to all that. And then after the memorial, I remember Franklin says, "You should get into dancing," he says to me, "tap dancing," which is what James Hillman did a lot of. And so it was very, I don't know. What do you say about all that? It's mysterious. It really is how those things manifest in my son as I'm working on this project.
So,
Yeah, you reminded me. I think that it was in Hillman's lecture about beauty that when he's talking about madhouses,
yeah.
and he's saying that he's emphasizing interconnection or interbeing with nature.
Yes.
That you are cut off from the mood of the world when you put.
Yes, yes. What do you think about this healing power of nature?
Oh, I think it's vitally important, and so did he. I mean, he got very involved in the environmental movement later with Theodore Roszak and the ideas behind eco psychology, as it's called. Um, and he spent a lot of time, Hillman, out in nature. I mean, he was a major gardener, had beautiful trees in his yard in Connecticut. Grew up, of course, on the sea in Atlantic City, and so nature was. And I myself was very involved. I wrote 2 books on natural history, and was very involved in a campaign to save a fish, the striped bass, which I also wrote a book about. So we had that in common, and he was also he talked a lot with Michael Ventura about the importance of getting beyond about anima mundi, he called it, soul in the world.
Mm.
He gave a remarkable lecture in Florence back in the early 1980s when he was living in Dallas, called Anima Mundi, where he emphasized how what we really need to do with psychology, where it needs to go, is into the natural, just the culture, which includes the natural world, and getting away from the personalized emphasis with just looking at parental problems and all those kinds of things.
Mhm.
Yeah, you said that he wasn't keen on psychedelics and was also very much in the Western tradition, and that's how I understood him as well. But what was his take on shamanism? I understand that you got in touch with Maladoma through him. So could you just please elaborate on that, Hillman and shamanism? What's the
Well,
there?
I don't know if he ever spoke about it per se, but I know that he respected Maladoma tremendously, and they did rituals together
Mhm.
at these men's gatherings, which were very, very significant for all the men there, and certainly for Hillman as well. I remember him telling me about one where Maladoma and they were out in nature in the woods, and was brushing this feather against him, and it was very profound. So. Um, he had this, and I'm going to talk about this for a minute too, because he had this relationship with the other world, which shamanism is about,
Mhm.
in
You
terms
mean
of his.
Maladoma, yeah?
Yeah, I'm talking about Hillman.
Hillman, yeah, okay, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, he had this interesting relationship that actually relates to Jung as well. He when Jung died, there was some. He wrote a letter to a medium that he knew, Eileen Garrett. This is Hillman, saying his death is a shaking event. I shall tell you some ESP tales, and I think what he was referring to was this tremendous thunderstorm that raged over the house at Kusnacht when Jung died, and legend had it that the severe lightning bolt destroyed this lakeside tree, under which Jung liked to conduct some of his analytic sessions when the weather was good. Um, Now, his biographer Deirdre Bear says that the lightning did split the tree, but it lost only its bark and survived for many years afterwards. So, but there were these kind of cosmic events happening, right? And so Hillman told the story of how when he went to the funeral, he was carrying this beautiful white lily,
Mhm.
and he was confronted by one of Jung's acolytes, a woman named Yolanda Jacobi, I think.
Hmm.
who was sort of chastising him for carrying this white lily, and when she had brought these incredible red roses. So then he was able to go into the room where Jung's body was, and he told me for the biography. He said, I don't know to this day whether I had an experience where it was his voice telling me, or
Hmm.
whether this was an idea or a dream or a fantasy or an imagination that I had, but it was somehow, don't weep or mourn, don't be in this kind of lily state, get out and work for me.
Hmm. Right.
So he did, and he didn't agree with all of Jung's psychology and Jung's emphasis on the self and growth in that way. Hillman took it to a much deeper place. Well, not deeper necessarily, but a place where the soul was what was tantamount. And then toward the end of James's life, he he had a dream um, about Jung, and I'm trying to see if I can. Yeah, okay. So um, Hillman in the dream was he was sort of back in Atlantic City and in this underground world of all these people working with various machines, and Jung was there, and Jung had a message for him, and it was a message that basically said that what they were doing was beyond human history.
Yeah.
Just that one line, beyond human history. Well, that's pretty shamanistic in itself, and in a sense. And um, at the end of his life too, and there was a book that came out after he died called Lament of the Dead, which he did with Sonu Shamdasani, who was the one who brought the Red Book
Yeah.
into public domain. And the Red Book, was this journal of these amazing encounters that Jung had with these various figures uh, for many, many years. And when Hillman read that book, he said, "Wow, I realized that Jung and I were on the same page all along."
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It was a very, very interesting revelation for him.
Yeah. Well, we're approaching the end of the hour. It's just let's come back to this soul's code again. That's one sentence I very much liked in your book is that this is like a synthesis or with pop Plato and pop, and that's how how do you see that?
Well, yeah, Neoplatonism is really about, the fact that there's this other world that is the real world, and we are living this kind of mirror image of it. It's interesting that comes up today in things like, are we living in a parallel reality, or are we living in a matrix, and these kinds of things. Now, Hillman never used those words, of course, but it's I think that was the central theme of his later years, and he was always, like, there were forces at work. There were always forces at work. In A Terrible Love of War, he was writing about how we had to come to terms with the fact that war has always existed in human history, and there is this kind of terrible beauty to it, and that has drawn civilizations forever, and we've got to realize that before we can move beyond it in a world where with nuclear weapons we could just blow ourselves up, right? But in the course of writing that book, I mean, he had falls. He was like very troubled by physical stuff happening to him. So I don't know if I quite answered your question, but we're at this pivotal time in the world. He also spoke once about the Aquarian age, which we have just entered into. Um, and Pluto just left Capricorn for the last time, if people are interested in that aspect of astrology. And Pluto was in Capricorn and made this huge cycle over many, many years, and now has entered Aquarius. And during that period, the Hillman spoke of how the old religion hangs on and it lashes out with a vengeance.
Mhm.
And I think that's what we're seeing, at least in America, with the terrible divide that we have in this country and the revival of Christian fundamentalism, and which Hillman was very opposed to in the sense of its rigidity. So, yeah, I don't know if anything follows from that. I'm just kind of roaming around in my head, but anything else you can ask?
Something
Yeah.
true?
We touched briefly these archetypes, and I remember one expression, archetypal heart. Heart.
Archetypal heart.
Yeah, archetypal
Yes.
heart. And as I remember, it was in revisioning psychology where Hillman visited Amazonas and then asked, yeah,
Go ahead.
if I don't
No, go
mistaken.
ahead.
Okay, and then there was a talk with indigenous people, and they said that the white men's problem is that they think and work and with head,
Yes.
and but they can't think with heart.
Well, also the similar was that you talk about your religion, but we dance ours or something like that was kind of
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the heart was obviously was where he was. That's the important part of soul growth is I think he said it once in one of the men's groups, that what we're all about here is the broken heart.
Mm-hmm.
And talk too about the wound. We have to get to what the wounds are in one another, and that was a very big emphasis with the men's groups, where they used things like ritual and fairy tales, and people, the media dismissed it often as just this group of guys going out in the woods and dancing to drums and saying, just talking down their wives. But it was so different than that. It was a really deeply profound spiritual experience where they went to some very deep places. And Hillman learned a great deal about his own life. Never wrote a book about it or anything, but he incorporated a lot of that into the Soul's Code, some of the stories that he'd heard, and his later works, Force of Character and Terrible Love of War. Force of Character was a book he wrote. He said it didn't come out of his books didn't come out of his personal experience. They came through him in a way. He had this profound thoughts about aging, but he'd never experienced them. So, he was, in my view, I wouldn't call him a mystic. That's kind of a too trite a word, but he was very in tune to these archetypal forces that he could call upon, or that utilized him as kind of a medium for what needed to be said. And he was it was a great privilege to have known him. I wish he was still here. He worked closely with me on the biography for the first volume and what became part of the second. We would meet regularly, and I'd give him the chapters and he would read them and expand upon them always. And I would tape those conversations and go back to the chapter and start incorporating, because, as we said before, I'm not a depth psychologist. I'm not an expert in this field, but I love uncovering new things. And he was always giving me that, always expanding upon themes, kind of reliving his life, through the biography in a way, while he was still on this planet. And it was very exciting, profound period of my life to be with him, and a great challenge to put together what turned into, I was going to write one volume in the beginning and it turned into 3. So, but he was worth it. I mean, 2,000 pages, I guess. And hopefully people will gain some real insights through it into themselves too.
Well, I can speak for myself. I certainly did. It's just a monumental picture of the depth psychology scene of the second half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st. So thank you so much. I've certainly expanded my horizon so much thanks to the first 2 volumes that I've read. I had a third volume still to go, but.
Oh, well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your books and for this conversation.